For example, I had an anecdote, I had a conversation with an educator, a social justice educator who worked at a very elite private school in New Jersey, and he was in the process of planning a very elaborate social justice-oriented trip to India about access to quality education in India, or lack thereof. And so someone said, well, why don't they just go to Newark? You know, like why do they need to go all the way to India? And he said, because the parents aren't paying 40 grand a year for their kids to go to Newark. And I think that, of course that was a private school, but I do think that there's sort of an obstacle in that a lot of the parents aren't necessarily wanting their kids to be taken to, you know, impoverished areas to experience racism as a part of their education. And I think they should.
Part of this has to come from students themselves, right, as young people, as emerging into, you know, the kinds of human beings that they want. The second thing I would say is that I also think that it's the experience alone. I mean, the experience can reinforce people's stereotypes as well. And so I think that there's got to be a couple things that go along with it. I think one thing is a very strong collaborative model. Because I think just, you know, having schools that are disconnected from communities come in and send people in to have an experience can be also somewhat exploitative. And then I think the third piece is to be very serious about reflection on that experience. And I think people were speaking to that. Like, what are the causes of what you're seeing here in front of you today? And connecting it to the systemic problems of racism in our society, so that the individual helping is not the only thing that needs to happen here. We need to challenge the structures that are really creating poverty and racism in the first place. So there's a big issue, but I do think that there's a lot that educators can do with young white people, but I think it has to be, it can't be a simple one-shot kind of thing.
There's this kind of issue around white guilt that's paralyzing in my community. I'm just wondering, like, what's the process that you go through to get to the place that you're at now in terms of your thinking? What needs to happen?
I think at its core, white ally work or anti-racism work or like personal white supremacy work is painful. It is painful and it's guilt-ridden and it sucks. It doesn't suck nearly as much as racism, but it's really hard and it's going to feel like crap for a long time. And I think that it has to, because if it doesn't, it didn't sink in deep enough.
That this issue of guilt and stuff, you shouldn't have to deal with that. You know, it should be like on the white people to figure this stuff out through community setting, right? And to also just kind of like creating a space where, you know, people can feel comfortable with making mistakes, right? That's been one of my experiences too.
It's not our responsibility to teach white people about racism, but there are actually many of us who don't mind. We need to get that straight. That we have the most knowledge about racism. We don't mind, some of us don't mind teaching if people really want to learn.
Like over a year, just like figuring out what our values were, what we wanted to do, and how we process and heal, and all those are very important components, right? But then at some point, the people of color on the CMS board, they were like, "What are you guys doing? You're supposed to create great resources for other white people, you know, and not just like be immobilized."
And I don't understand this thing about guilt. What I feel is tremendous sadness because I work with kids who are miserable. And so I try to heal the sadness that I see, and I cry a lot about it.
That the step, like the fear of making mistakes, that has been a big component to it. And there has to be like white people have to hold each other accountable and say, okay, you gotta be willing to make mistakes. You gotta be willing to take risks. It's messy work. There's no way you can do this work and not screw up.
If you don't feel personally responsible and terrified to make mistakes, then you are not getting it. It has not sunk in deep enough. And like, it's not personal yet.
Okay? And I have a foster son who owes a debt. He was a drug dealer. And he bucked on a guy 5 years ago, and the guy's come back and said, "You owe me money, and if you don't pay it, I'm going to kill you and your family." Well, I take that seriously. I don't have the money to pay it, but I did ask my wealthy cousin if he would pay it, and he told me I needed therapy.
Let's develop concrete issues, and we really need to build a national movement. That's why we came here. We came here to advocate building a national movement, a concrete movement. This is not ready. Around an agreed upon agenda, concrete goals, concrete strategies, concrete tactics, that either we're going to work around or not.
I find this very, very lonely. I don't work with anybody. I'm the only person in my school building that thinks the way I do, okay? The kids seem to understand the way I think because I've let them teach me how to think this way, okay? And I try to understand their culture and be as sensitive as I possibly can, but I'm still trying to get at that stupid shit that I learned when I was growing up in Richmond that wouldn't ride beside African Americans on the bus. So, you know, it's a constant struggle. I think it's very lonely.
I guess my question / comment to the past couple of people, what do we do about the term, well, I think you answered this in a certain way, but I'm really struggling and scared, frankly, by the brazen proclamation of a post-racial society. What do we do? What is that? I hope we can have a conversation about it. I know we are having a conversation about it in a lot of threads, but that's a term that I don't get, and I think we're all here for reasons having to do with the very nebulous umbrella of that term and its problematic aspects.
We reject it. Like, post-racial, we reject it. That we are not at a point when we can talk about being, you know, colorblind, or that we're not at a point in which, you know, oh, I grew up and I just don't see it. No, yes, we do. We live in a racist society. Of course it's there. This notion of post-racial, it's complex how it came about, but it's part of this kind of denial syndrome, which is part of white privilege, which is part of a white supremacist society, period. Like, so when it comes up, when people say, oh no, we've moved beyond those issues, right? We've moved, you know, you reject it, you call it out. You call it out for what it is. We're saying we're trying to get around an issue that is a systemic, both personal and institutionalized racism is thoroughly ingrained into everyday life, into all the institutions that we interact with in the West, period.
I think that a lot of white people want to think about, well, I'm just who I am, the good, well-intentioned person that I am entering this situation, and everybody in this organization is just who they are as individual people. And I think that when people try to do this kind of work, they have to realize that it's done, as one of the people I think said, under the weight of history. We're not just who we are as individual people working in these organizations. We are part of a whole system that's had 200-300 years behind it, and that currently, you know, recreates racial inequality and racial oppression today. And so we represent our races on some level, and we also bring into these organizations a lot of the habits and prejudices and racism, if you will, that we have, you know, been born and raised with.
I almost wish this would have been a fishbowl conversation, and I would have gladly sat on the outside of a room full of white people talking to other white people about how they do this work, because that's the most fascinating thing to me. And what I want to know is how, just like in any movement, you need colleagues, you need rituals, you need a way to keep supporting yourself in the struggle so you don't lose sight of what you set out to do. I find that my colleagues now, the ones that have mortgages and kids just like me, who have maybe stepped away from their earlier 20-year-old convictions a little bit, have lost that sense of colleague, that sense of community. And so for those of you who are white, who are doing this work, who are feeling like you're making progress, my question is, how do you keep getting over those societal barriers? Because every message that's out there in our world tells you that racism doesn't exist, that we're post-racial, that really is not so much of a problem as some might have you believe. The culture is working against us. And so I'm really curious about how white people who are doing this work and doing it well support each other.
But almost all the white people that I interviewed reflected that they felt themselves to be in some ways between two worlds. They felt like they had made something of a break with the dominant mainstream white society. And on the other hand, they weren't themselves members of communities of color. So where does a white anti-racist activist stand in American society today? Is there even really a term for it that people can claim? And, you know, so what are the implications of that? And I think one of the implications is the importance of doing community building work. That the organizations that we create can't just spend their time analyzing internal oppression within them. They've also got to say, what are we really sharing together? Why should for example, a black person want to spend the time to teach a white person about racism? Well, if they're open to learning, but if they're also open to contributing something, and if there feels like there's a common value basis, or that somehow we're forming a community together trying to do something important and meaningful. What really sustains any activist, I think, work is not just winning things, or because you can also lose the next day, and it's a long-term struggle. It's really the value of the relationships.
Of color, and how can they be addressed? I'm going to give you a concrete answer. Turn down this air conditioner. For one, that's a definite start because there's a cultural difference. I'm freezing in here. So if you want to try to build a relationship with me and some of my cousins, turn down this air conditioner.